Hello, everyone. I'm your instructor, Christine. Here's the overview of Chapter 1. I'm going to focus only on the most important concepts, but of course you should always read the whole chapter. So let's get started. All right, so first thing we need to consider is what is a social problem? Now, there's not an easy answer. That's the first thing we need to recognize. There's not one answer in regard to what a social problem is. For example, some people might think rap music is a social problem, or that TikTok is a social problem, or the use of the media to communicate with others almost to the exclusion of talking face to face is a social problem. But other people might not agree with that. And so I tend to think of social problems as issues or situations that are harmful to or that affect a large number of people, um, that are potentially harmful to people, and that um, the vast majority of people in a society would agree is a problem. That's my way of thinking about social problems. Other people would disagree with that. But one thing we can say for sure is that what constitutes a social problem is socially constructed. If you've taken Social 1 before, you've certainly heard the term. Sorry, I'm going to adjust my laptop here, a little crooked. You've certainly heard the term social construction. What that means is when sociologists or political scientists or anthropologists say that something is socially constructed, what we mean by that is that society has created a meaning for a particular term or idea or concept. So when I say that social problems and what constitutes a social problem is socially constructed, that means that depending upon the society, one practice or condition might be viewed a social problem, but in a different environment, different society, that may not be viewed as a social problem. Okay, so um, a lot of what we think of as social problems are largely based on our social perceptions. And these, of course, change over time. And they change from place to place, from country to country, from society to society. So that's one good thing. We can all agree that there's no agreement on what necessarily constitutes a social problem, but we can agree that they are socially constructed. Okay. Let me move this. Wants to only stay up here. There we go. All right. So one view of how to identify a social problem is known as social constructionism. Now, social constructionism is a theoretical perspective that helps us to identify that we all are influenced by society and the time period during which we live. So none of us, become who we are in a vacuum without any outside influences. Of course, we're influenced. We're influenced by early on our families, our peers, schools, maybe even religion, depending upon how whether a person practices a religion and how devoutly they practice it or not devoutly. Um, Media. We're all influenced by these social institutions around us. You'd almost have to live in a cave somewhere to not have any sort of outside influences on you from these various social institutions. And based upon what we perceive in the world around us and how we attach meanings to these experiences, we determine that some things are social problems and other things are not. So for social constructionists, their idea is that culture plays a huge part in terms of how we identify whether something is a social problem. And culture is all of the values, traditions, beliefs, um, the language, the religion, um, the history that's part of a society. And so for us in the United States, we have what we could call an American culture. Now, of course, that's very different from, say, a British culture or um, a Muslim culture somewhere in a Muslim nation state. And so, how we in the United States look at the social conditions around us and whether we identify them as social problems is largely constructed by the meanings we attach to the things in our social environments, the culture that we are surrounded in, and partly by who else is in our social environments that are shaping our ideas of what is a social problem and what is not. So, um, I'm going to skip through this. You can read about Jane Addams and W.B. Du Bois and the quicksand thing. All right, so I want to focus on sociological imagination. This is a concept that was developed by C. Wright Mills, who was a very well-known sociologist of his time. I believe he came up with this in the early 1940s, 1941, 42, somewhere in that time period. And C. Wright Mills came up with this concept because he found that when teaching undergraduate students, and keep in mind in 1941, 42, there would have been very few women in college. It would have been mostly men and mostly white men. He found that it was difficult to teach students how to think like sociologists, how to take themselves out of their own experiences and background and look at the society around them through a less biased lens. And so he created the idea of sociological imagination to describe how you go about thinking like a sociologist. First off, you have to think about the world around you by recognizing that people that we see, we may make a quick judgment about them, but we have to recognize that the judgment that we make is based on very little evidence, very little knowledge. And so the first part of it is the first part of sociological imagination and the two obligations is we have to be willing to step outside of the easy answer and try to understand what were the social institutions in that person's life, the social environments that person was in, that helped to shape and influence who that person is that we're now seeing. So I want you to consider a homeless person that you see sitting outside of, say, a 7-Eleven. You park your car, you notice there's a homeless person sitting out there with a sign that says please help. Now, when you park your car and you notice that person, many people, I'm not saying you, but many people might look at that individual and think, oh, another lazy ass, just asking for a handout. That person likely gets out of the car, purposely looks away from the homeless person, doesn't want to make eye contact, because once you make eye contact with somebody, you have to recognize their humanity, that they're a fellow human being. And so you avoid eye contact. You, again, I'm saying you, not you necessarily, but this hypothetical person that I'm describing. This person gets out of the car, avoids eye contact with the homeless person, and goes into the store, buys whatever they were planning to buy, comes back out, again avoids any eye contact, any sort of communication with the homeless person, gets back into the car and drives away and doesn't give it another thought. A lot of people do that. And they make judgments about that person. This person's lazy, this person's drug addicted, this person's an alcoholic, they think they know all about this person. When in fact, they've reached that conclusion with no information at all. The only information they have is this person is sitting outside a 7-Eleven with a sign. That's the only information they have, and yet they've made all these judgments. Now, I hope you'll agree with me that that's a pretty stupid way to go around analyzing the social environment around you, is simply by relying on what you perceive when you look at someone. For example, We can be very wrong when we look at somebody and make all these judgments and assessments about them, even though we have no real evidence except what we see. Many people over my lifetime of teaching, many students, have over the years come to the conclusion that I'm a lesbian, which doesn't bother me. I mean, it would only bother me if I thought there was something wrong with being a lesbian. It doesn't really bother me at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with being a lesbian. However, I'm not. I'm not a lesbian. And yet they make these judgments. Why? Because of what they see, what they hear. And when I've asked students, why did you think that? Well, it's because of the way you dress. It's because of the way you talk. It's because of the way you present yourself. That's their litmus test, okay? Which is pretty stupid when you think about it. Just by judging someone upon the style of dress or the way they speak or the way they carry themselves. And the same thing is true of homeless individuals. We may think that we know all about them simply because of the stereotypes that we have in our heads, and yet we don't know anything about them. And so if we were using our sociological imagination, what we would do when we see that homeless person is consider what social institutions were part of this person's life that perhaps did not provide the support or the resources that this person needed to be fully functioning and contributing member of society. We don't know. Maybe that person lost his or her job and then was evicted. Or maybe that person lost the job, was evicted, then was sleeping in the car, but then the car got repossessed. So now this person's out on the street. Or maybe this person suffered a terrible personal loss of a loved one and just didn't recover from it and entered into chronic depression and found it difficult to go to work and lost the job as a result, and then all, the domino effect. We can't really know unless we actually talk to the person. But we would rather just judge people because we are unwilling to try to understand their condition, their situation. So the first part with the sociological imagination is really just trying to understand the world around you without judgment and recognizing that social institutions play a huge role in how we experience the society around us. And the people in our social environments contribute a lot as well. The second part of this is hopefully once we recognize that there is a social problem, we are moved to some type of social activism. And I don't mean hitting the streets and carrying signs and yelling, hey, hey, ho, ho, so-and-so's got to go. That's great. I've done that many times myself. But that's not the only way to be socially active. You can be socially active by voting. Yeah, go figure. By voting. Wow. That's a huge power that we all have. And I encourage you to at least use that. All right. Let's see. Already covered that. All right. Oh, I guess that's already it. Okay. So, I want you to, I hope that as you move through this class, you will really think about, number one, social problems that you really care deeply about. And those could be any number of things. You might really be concerned about climate change, the environment. You might really be concerned about animal cruelty. You might really be concerned about voting rights. You might really be concerned about racial polarization in the United States, etc. We don't all have to agree on what are the most important social problems that we have to tackle, but I think that we can all agree that there are quite a few social issues out there that most people would agree are social problems. Homelessness, poverty, inadequate education, inadequate access to health care. And yes, racial polarization of the United States. So when I hope that you will commit to thinking broadly about these issues and recognizing that while you might not agree with someone in class or even myself, that's okay. We can agree to disagree. But my hope is that you'll be able to understand how other people might regard a social condition as a social problem, whereas someone else might not. For example, some people think that smoking pot recreationally it's a social problem, and that's why it is. Since the early 1970s, pot has been, marijuana has been a Schedule I drug. And according to the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Control Act of 1972, marijuana has been classified as a Schedule I drug. A Schedule I drug is a drug that has no social or medicinal value, according to the US government. Other drugs in that category, heroin. Okay, those are two very, very different drugs. One is highly addictive, the other one may be psychologically addictive, but it has not been shown to be physically addictive. And yet they're in the same class. Recently, Chuck Schumer, who is the Speaker for the Senate, the Senate Majority Leader, he has announced, it was just this earlier the week, it was the week of July 12th, he announced that he's going to use all of his political clout to try to pass a federal law that will make recreational use of marijuana legal, and that law would also erase all the drug convictions of people who are currently sitting in prison because of a drug conviction having to do with marijuana. So I don't think that using pot recreationally is a social problem. Some people do. Again, for the people who think it is a social problem, they're basing their idea on their experiences, their knowledge, their information. I'm basing mine on my experiences, my information, my knowledge. I don't think that people smoking pot recreationally is harming a large number of people in the United States. On the other hand, I do think that the opioid crisis is a real issue. And so I would say, yes, that's a real social problem, because opioids are highly addictive. So that's it for this chapter. I know it was pretty brief, but that's okay. I just wanted to cover those main ideas. I'll see you for chapter 2. Thank you.